It was a bright afternoon when James decided to treat himself to something special. After weeks of hard work, he felt he deserved a little indulgence. The city's bustling streets led him to the high-end shopping district, a place he usually avoided. It wasn't that he felt unwelcome, though sometimes he did, but more that he didn't see the need to spend his money on things that often felt more about status than substance. Still, today felt different. He had a good job, steady income, and wanted to buy something nice for himself. James stepped into a luxury boutique that gleamed with polished floors, glass displays, and perfectly arranged merchandise. The store was quiet, the kind of quiet that reminded him of libraries where every noise seemed magnified. A soft hum of instrumental music played in the background, almost drowned out by the faint chatter of a couple browsing near the entrance. James walked in confidently, but he could feel eyes on him almost instantly. It was the same feeling he had in certain space, as a heavy, invisible weight of judgment. He brushed it off. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, he was here to shop. His hands trailed lightly over the racks of finely tailored suits, stopping occasionally to admire the stitching, the fabric, the care that went into making them. The storekeeper, a tall, middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a sharper gaze, approached him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with something James couldn't quite place. "I'm just looking," James replied with a small smile, nodding toward a display of ties. "Thinking of getting one of these." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes scanned James from head to toe. "Those are quite expensive," he said, his voice dropping slightly, as if to ensure no one else heard. James raised an eyebrow. "That's fine," he said evenly. "I can't afford it." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he hovered for a moment longer before stepping back. James turned his attention back to the ties, selecting one in a deep burgundy shade that caught his eye. As he did, he noticed a jacket on a nearby mannequin and decided to try it on. He approached the fitting room, but before he could enter, the storekeeper reappeared, blocking his path. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said, his tone no longer polite. "We reserve the fitting rooms for serious customers." James froze, the words sinking in. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice calm but firm. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "We've had issues with the broken bar, people coming in just to loiter, or a broken bar damage merchandise. I'm sure you understand." James felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He placed the tie and jacket down carefully on a nearby counter. "I was going to buy those," he said. The man's response was a dismissive shrug. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable shopping elsewhere." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice cut through the tense silence. "Is there a problem here?" Both James and the storekeeper turned to see an older man entering the store. His tailored suit and air of authority made it clear he was someone important. "No problem at all, sir," the storekeeper said quickly, his demeanor shifting instantly. The older man looked at James, then back at the storekeeper. "Are you sure? Because it seems to me that you're about to lose a customer," the storekeeper stammered. I was just ensuring a." The older man raised a hand to silence him. "I've heard enough." He turned to James, his face softening. "I'm terribly sorry for the way you've been treated. My name is Robert, and I own this store." James blinked, recognition dawning. Robert was the father of his boss, the founder of the company where James worked. "I came by to check on things," Robert continued, his voice steady but sharp. "And I walk in to see a customer being disrespected. Unacceptable." He turned to the storekeeper, his tone turning icy. "You're done here. Pack your things." The man paled. "Sir, yeah." "Now," Robert said firmly. The storekeeper nodded stiffly and walked away, his head down. Robert turned back to James, his expression apologetic. "I'm so sorry for that. Please, let me make it up to you. Anything you'd like in the store is yours. On the house." James hesitated, feeling a mix of emotions: anger, relief, gratitude. "Thank you," he said finally. "But I don't need anything for free. I just wanted to be treated fairly." Robert nodded. "And you deserve nothing less. I hope this experience hasn't soured your day too much. Please, let me help you personally find what you need." With that, James followed Robert through the store, feeling a small sense of vindication. He wasn't looking for charity or special treatment, just respect. And for today, at least, He'd gotten it. As James followed Robert deeper into the store, he couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere had shifted. The other staff, who had been hesitant or indifferent earlier, now moved with a renewed energy, offering friendly smiles and quick assistance. It was as though Robert's presence had flipped a switch, transforming the air from tense to welcoming. Robert led James to a section of the store that seemed even more exclusive, tucked behind a glass partition. The shelves here displayed items James hadn't even seen when he first walked in: limited edition watches, handcrafted leather shoes, and suits so finely tailored they seemed to shimmer under the soft lighting. "This," Robert said, gesturing to the collection, "is where we keep our finest pieces. I believe a man who has worked as hard as you deserves something from here. Please, take your time." James hesitated, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't sure how to feel about all this. Part of him wanted to simply walk out, to refuse the gesture entirely. Another part, though, recognized the sincerity in Robert's tone and the effort he was making to set things right. He allowed himself to browse, taking in the craftsmanship of the pieces around him. After a few minutes, a particular suit caught his eye: a deep charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, paired with a crisp white shirt and a navy tie. It was classic, timeless, and exuded a quiet confidence. "This one," James said, running his fingers along the fabric. "An excellent choice," Robert said with a nod. "Why don't we get you fitted? It'll take just a moment, and I'll make sure you have the best tailor in-house working on it." James agreed, and within moments, a young tailor arrived, armed with measuring tape and a professional demeanor. He worked quickly, making notes and adjustments with precision. James felt the anger and frustration of earlier fading, replaced by a growing sense of pride. This wasn't just about the suit, it was about reclaiming his right to be treated with dignity. As the fitting wrapped up, Robert leaned against a nearby counter, watching with a thoughtful expression. "James," he said suddenly, "I recognize your name. You work at one of my son's companies, don't you?" James looked up, surprised. "Yes, I do, at Greystone Enterprises." Robert smiled. "He's spoken highly of you, said you've been a real asset to the team. It's good to finally meet you, though I wish it had been under better circumstances." James nodded, unsure of what to say. Robert continued, his tone softening. "You know, I started this store decades ago with the hope of creating a space where everyone would feel welcome. Hearing about what happened today, a broken bar, it's not just disappointing, it's a failure on my part. I promise you, I'll be taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." James appreciated the honesty in Robert's words. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot." By the time James left the store, the suit neatly packed in a sleek garment bag, the sun had begun to set. The streets were bathed in a golden light, and the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. As he walked home, James couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. It wasn't just about being kicked out of a store or the apology that followed. It was about how easily assumptions could be made and how those assumptions could shape the way people were treated. But it was also about how moments like this, uncomfortable, infuriating as they were, could spark change, even in small ways. And as he glanced at the bag in his hand, James allowed himself a small smile, not because of the suit, though it was undoubtedly the finest he'd ever owned, but because he had stood his ground. In a world that often demanded silence, he had chosen to speak through his presence, his dignity, and his refusal to be dismissed. James had just left the boutique, the fresh memory of dignity restored still swirling in his mind, when a small crowd caught his attention. A man's voice, harsh and raised, sliced through the usual hum of the city. It was coming from a boutique a few doors down, another high-end establishment, the kind James had never stepped into until today. Curiosity pulled him closer. He arrived to see an older black man, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his suit showing signs of both care and wear, standing near the entrance. His hands clutched a sleek garment bag, now slightly crumpled, as he spoke in calm, measured tones. "Sir," the man was saying, "I haven't done anything wrong. I simply came to buy a gift for my grandson." The storekeeper, a tall man with a severe expression, stood in front of him, his posture tense and unyielding. "I've already asked you to leave," he barked. "This isn't the place for a broken bar browsing without intent to purchase." The older man's eyes flickered with a mixture of hurt and resolve. "I told you I can pay for what I want. "Why do you assume otherwise?" the crowd whispered among themselves, but no one stepped forward. James felt his fists clench. This was too familiar, too fresh. Without a second thought, he stepped through the small gathering and positioned himself next to the older man. "Is there a problem here?" James asked, his voice calm but firm, mirroring the composure he'd seen earlier from Robert. The storekeeper's eyes darted between James and the older man. "This doesn't concern you," he said curtly. "It does now," James replied, his tone unwavering. "This man has the right to shop here without being treated like a criminal." The older man looked at James, a spark of gratitude in his weary eyes. "Thank you, young man," he said softly. The storekeeper scoffed. "People like you always pull this stunt, thinking you can." "People like us?" James interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "You mean customers, hard-working individuals who came to spend their money here?" The storekeeper's face reddened, but before he could respond, a new voice entered the scene. "What's going on here?" It was Robert. He had been on his way to his car when he noticed the commotion. His authoritative presence silenced the whispers as he approached. The storekeeper, clearly rattled, stammered, "Just dealing with some broken bar disturbances, sir." Robert's gaze shifted to James, then to the older man, and finally to the storekeeper. His expression hardened. "Disturbances? That's not what it looks like to me." The older man spoke up, his voice steady. "I only wanted to buy something for my grandson's graduation, but this gentleman seems to think I'm not fit to be here." Robert's eyes narrowed at the storekeeper. "Is that so?" The storekeeper's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Apologize," Robert said sharply. The storekeeper hesitated, then muttered, "I'm sorry." "Louder," Robert demanded, his tone broking no argument. "I'm sorry," the storekeeper said again, this time with more force, though his eyes didn't meet the older man's. Robert turned to the older man, his voice softening. "Please, sir, allow me to assist you personally. I'm the owner of this block of boutiques, and I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my stores." The older man looked at Robert, then at James, and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with quiet dignity. As the crowd began to disperse, James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the older man smiling at him. "Your mother must be proud," the man said warmly. James smiled back. "She taught me to stand up for what's right." Together, they walked back into the store, where Robert ensured the older man's shopping experience was nothing short of exceptional. And as James watched the man leave with a wide smile and a neatly packed gift for his grandson, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Change wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about showing up, speaking out, and proving, one moment at a time, that respect and dignity were non-negotiable. As James watched the older man walk away, gratitude evident in his every step, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't just about the suit or the apology. It was about the principle. About ensuring that the next person wouldn't have to fight the same battle. Robert lingered nearby, his expression thoughtful as he watched James. Finally, he broke the silence. "You have a strong sense of justice," he said. "I respect that." James nodded, his gaze still on the retreating figure of the older man. "It's not something you can ignore when you've lived it," he replied quietly. Robert sighed, his hands slipping into his pockets. "I wish I could say this was the first time I've seen something like this happen, but I'd be lying. It's not always easy to see the flaws in a system you built. Moments like these remind me there's still so much work to do." James turned to him, his expression measured. "You have the power to make changes." "More than most." Robert met his gaze, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "You're right, and I intend to." He paused, then added, "You've opened my eyes today, James. You've shown me what leadership really looks like." James didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, much less receiving praise from someone as influential as Robert. But before he could say anything, Robert extended a hand. "I could use someone like you," he said. "Not just at Greystone Enterprises, but as part of something bigger. I'm thinking of starting an initiative, a way to address these issues across all my businesses. Training, accountability, and real consequences for discrimination. You've already shown you're not afraid to stand up when it counts." "What do you say?" James blinked, caught off guard. You want me to help with that? I do, Robert said firmly. You've got the perspective and the integrity we need, and I think you would make an excellent leader. James hesitated. The idea was daunting, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for such a responsibility. But then he thought of the older man, of the countless others who might face similar situations. If he could be a part of changing that, how could he say no? I'll do it, James said finally, his voice steady. Robert smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. Good. Let's get to work. Over the weeks that followed, James threw himself into the project with a passion he hadn't felt in years. Together with Robert and a small, dedicated team, they developed a comprehensive program aimed at fostering inclusivity and respect within Robert's businesses. They introduced mandatory training for all employees, established anonymous reporting systems, and created partnerships with organizations dedicated to combating discrimination. Word of the initiative spread quickly, earning praise from both employees and customers. And while there were challenges along the way, a pushback from some, skepticism from others, James stayed focused, driven by the knowledge that he was making a difference. One day, as he was leaving the office late in the evening, he received a handwritten note. It was from the older man he had defended that day outside the boutique. Thank you for standing up for me, the note read. You reminded me that kindness and courage still exist in this world. My grandson loved the suit, by the way. He says he'll wear it when he interviews for his first job, so he can look as sharp as his grandfather. James folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, a small smile playing on his lips. The journey was far from over, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, James felt a quiet certainty settle within him. Change wasn't just possibly, it was already happening.